Welcome to the periodic table and a poetic version of the periodic table, which is born out of the ideas that I'm going to share in this video. The next video will be the actual periodic table poem. So after I'd been a science teacher already for about 4 years, I decided to train up as a Waldorf science teacher, and had two of my lecturers who really blew my mind, opened me up to a new way of understanding and looking at the table. The first was the art teacher who, when we were doing wood carving, described wood as fossilized sunlight. And from a scientific perspective, that really captured my imagination because, in a sense, that's exactly what it is. One could argue it's also kind of fossilized air because the carbon dioxide from the air is trapped down in solid form. But I prefer the sunlight version because of the energy that's held within the structure of the wood. And then our science teacher, when he was telling us about the periodic table, looked at hydrogen and helium and kind of saw youthful qualities in there, like what they were, the first elements to be made, kind of the newborns. And then as evolution in the stars and suns created bigger and bigger elements, so those elements demonstrate aspects of growing up of age, the metals and the non-metals, showing kind of teenage sexuality, awakening as we enter the lower periods, and then down to old age and death. So I'm going to go through that picture with you now. But what I liked about that concept is, from a holistic perspective, that we tend to think of matter as just a blank thing. It's just something that's there. But scientifically, when we look at it, we know it's been through an evolution. It's had a birth. And from a certain perspective, it has a kind of a death. Besides the fact that in billions and billions and billions of years' time, all matter will ultimately disintegrate back into energy. So there is definitely a birth and a death, starting with energy at the top, ending with energy at the bottom. And from a Smuts perspective, what he says is that every level of holism, and here we're looking at the level of matter, or what I call the substance of matter, is going to, he says, mirror in certain ways the behavior of other levels or other substances. And so I really liked it. I only discovered holism many years after doing this work as a Waldorf teacher. But it made complete sense to me because the fact that the periodic table of elements, which is kind of like the Bible for chemists, can also be like the actual Bible, read in different ways. And I like that this can be read as kind of a picture that tells us, shows us aspects of human life and human aging. So the first table at the top, period 1, is where the elements began, you can say, at the Big Bang. And even still to this day, that's where you will find most hydrogen and helium, is out in the suns and the stars, out in space. And that's period 1, that's the top level of the periodic table. Now, in the poem, I refer to hydrogen as masculine and I refer to helium as feminine. And that's just me making it up, but because I want to try and create some characters out of it. But helium is perfect. And although I refer to helium as she, you can read the symbol of helium, it's HE, which is he. So I wrote it in the poem, as you can see at the bottom there, SH and then capital HE, she. And I like that because that perfection, it's kind of this, the elements strive to become like those noble gases, helium and all the elements underneath it. And I thought it would be a nice idea as a kind of a balance, almost an androgynous holding together of the masculine and the feminine, which is anyway, the young child has qualities like that. They haven't developed sexuality overtly yet, and certainly sexual interest. So that's the first period, still very youthful, out in the heavens. And then we come to periods 2 and 3. So these are the elements made by the suns and the stars. They're the dominant elements that we encounter here on the Earth, on the Earth's crust. If you look at the pie chart on the left, the only odd one out there is iron, which is 5%. All the others are in periods 2 and 3. And here we have the metals and the non-metals for the first time. And the metals also, which I learned in my Waldorf training, but I haven't found evidence for it since then. So if you know, please let me know. But the alchemists apparently connected metals to the feminine and non-metals to the masculine. and saw their interaction as a kind of a attraction. And so I've, not in this particular poem, but I've written another poem called Acid Man and Lady Bass, which is on my Facebook page, Deep Science Education Facebook page, if you're interested to look at it. But here we find a real dynamic. Now, for those of you who, I mean, there's a lot of drama, dynamic, a lot of change in perceptions around sexuality, sexual orientation, and sexual identity. And one can use this in teaching. I certainly have, because not only do you have the so-called heterosexual attraction between the non-metals and the metals, you also get non-metals reacting with each other. Anytime you hear carbonate, sulfate, carbon dioxide, these are all non-metals reacting with each other. And any metal alloy is metals joining with each other. So there is a kind of a precedent within the elements of some forms of homosexuality. But of course, you've also got B, boron, and Si, silicon. If you look in the middle, you'll see they're gray. They're not metals or non-metals. We call them metalloids. And they have properties of both metals and non-metals. So there's something of a different kind of sexuality, if you want to make that analogy. And when I teach this to the early teenagers, I don't shy away from that. And I know it gives the teenagers a huge amount of strength and comfort and interest and engagement about their own learning about their own sexuality. And so there's very easy to have a kind of an analogous relationship between the chemistry and human experience, the holistic between these two levels. And I've been doing that now for many years, and the students really value it if one does that respectfully. I then take a section in the poem just on carbon, because carbon is the anchor of all living compounds, of organic compounds. And it has a very interesting reactivity. If you look at the picture at the top on the left, and if you look at the kind of a carbon that's in the middle, so the second one on the right-hand side, you can see it's bonded to 4 other carbons. And each of those bonds make those carbons stay attached to each other. So it's not like the so-called heterosexuality of what's called ionic bonding in science. They just take and give electrons and then kind of mush together. Here it's more a one-on-one bonding, and so it's a real relationship. And so covalent bonding, the kind of anchor of that is carbon, forming committed relationships, one can say. So you can have so many beautiful conversations using chemistry about not just sexuality, about relationships and so on. So there's a verse just for carbon. And then we move down the table further, and that's the transition elements. They're all metals, but they don't exhibit the same kind of polarized metal reactivity as the higher metals. There's something more balanced and stable about those. And I relate those to kind of middle age, where there's a subtlety in difference. If you look in the top row, Fe is iron, next to it is Co, cobalt, and then nickel, and on the other side, manganese and chromium, vanadium, titanium. These are all metals that can be alloyed together to make different kinds of steels. And so although they're different, they're subtly different, they're kind of like brothers. And I've heard the term, the brothers of iron. Something quite male still about those. And then down at the bottom, towards the right, you've got Au, which is gold. And gold is often perceived quite feminine. Again, this sense of beauty and perfection that's captured in gold. And so I do the same, despite the fact that, of course, you could argue quite differently around masculinity and femininity. But I don't play too much on these ones, but I've done that in the poem, and you'll hear it when it comes. And then we come down to kind of old age and dying, the radioactive elements. Particularly the very bottom row there, U at the bottom, uranium, you'll know about that. But all the elements that are in the blackened block, they are all radioactive. Some of them don't actually exist, but it doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about those technicalities. So that's all I want to share with you about the basics. I'm going to end this video now. Please watch the next one where I actually read through the poem, and hopefully you'll get a sense of not just this development and growth, but hopefully another number of pictures. And if you are a science teacher, please feel absolutely free to share it with your class and to take it into your own teaching in whatever way that you deem is appropriate. So thanks for sharing this one, and hopefully I'll see you soon with the poem.